We're delighted this afternoon to have Professor Helbrands with us over in Singapore. Quick introduction, Professor Helbrands is the S. Rajaratnam Professor of Strategic Studies in RSIS during his time over here. Back in the US, he's the Henry A. Kissinger Distinguished Professor of Global Affairs at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, as well as a Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. He has got other achievements which I shall not read out. But what I'm happy to do is to introduce Professor Brands who will be presenting on this topic, Understanding the New Cold War, US-China Relations under Trump and Beyond. So without further ado, I'll pass the time over to Professor Brands. He will speak for about 30 minutes, thereabouts, and I really strongly encourage all of you to think of questions to ask him. This will be his final lecture in Singapore, so if you have any questions you want to ask him in person, this is probably your last chance. Otherwise, you've got to pay him a visit in DC. So over to you, Hal.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me. It's been a lot of fun to spend a week or two in Singapore, and it's an honor to have the opportunity to speak with everybody today. So when I was picking topics for these seminars, I thought I would do one that was sort of a big picture overview of American strategy in Asia and the Pacific, and so that was what I did last week. And I thought it would be a good idea to sort of use the second one to zoom in a little bit more closely on the U.S.-China relationship and on the question of where the United States is going in its policy toward Beijing. And in one sense, I think the rationale for that is obvious. The U.S.-China relationship or competition or rivalry or whatever you want to call it is the most important relationship in the international system today. And I think that as important as conflict in the Middle East or the war in Ukraine or the situation on the Korean Peninsula or any other crisis or event may be, the thing that will do the most to shape the future trajectory of not just Asia but the world is the U.S.-China competition. And so it repays the effort that one makes to spend a little bit of time unpacking it. The second reason is that I think it's a good time to do this like right now, as of August 26, 2025, because I think there's real uncertainty about where the U.S. is going in this area as in so many areas. And the way that I have sometimes chosen to put this is that if you think of three really wide-ranging outcomes, a Cold War, a hot war, or some sort of diplomatic and economic grand bargain, all of those things are on the table, and none of them can actually be excluded if you look out over the next few years. And so what I want to try to do is give a sense of how we got here in the U.S.-China relationship, think about what the Trump administration has been doing and trying to do over its first 7 months in office, and then make sense of what the prospects are and the road ahead. As always, I like to start with a little bit of history, and I think it helps situate where we are at the present moment if you understand how the U.S.-China relationship has unfolded since the creation of the People's Republic in 1949. And the way that I like to phrase it is that I think we are now in the fourth era of modern U.S.-China relations. The first era really ran from the end of the Chinese Civil War in 1949 through the late 1960s or maybe the early 1970s. And this was an era of deep, bitter, sometimes violent animosity between the United States and the People's Republic of China. During this period, the United States and Mao's China fought two undeclared wars in Korea overthrow the government in China and to undermine it and to weaken its potential. And we can debate whether that is an accurate characterization of U.S. policy today. What's undeniable is that it was an accurate characterization of U.S. policy during the early years of the PRC government. And so there's sort of a long historical tail to this period. That period ends in the late 60s and early 1970s after you have the Sino-Soviet split, and particularly after you have a very violent clash along the Ussuri River border between the Soviet Union and China. And this opens up the second phase of U.S.-China relations in the modern era, which I would call sort of the period of being tacit allies, really from 1971 until about 1989. And this was based purely on an enemy of my enemy as my friend logic. China was still just barely coming out of the Cultural Revolution. At this point, I don't think American policymakers had much illusion about the fact that Mao and the people around him envisioned a fundamentally different future for the world than American policymakers did. But Chinese-Soviet hostility created an opportunity for the U.S. and China to reconcile. And in fact, they did. And they engaged in extremely productive cooperation during the 1970s and 1980s that had a massive impact on the Cold War and on the subsequent shape of the international system. That involved covert cooperation to frustrate the Soviet Union in places like Afghanistan. It involved the sale of U.S. technology and certain weaponry to China, particularly in the 1980s. It involved the beginning of a massive American project of technology transfer to China and efforts to draw China into the international economy, to hasten its development, to make it a better bulwark against Soviet power. And in the end, one of the things that did end the Soviet Union was the fact that from the 1970s onward, it had to reckon with a two-front competition. It was competing against the United States, NATO, and the West, and Europe, and with a China that was increasingly backed by the United States and Asia as well, and the military burdens and the economic burdens of doing that were pretty heavy, and the Soviet Union couldn't bear them in the end. That period really ends in 1989, and there are two things that happen in 1989 that are really of fundamental importance. The first is the fall of the Berlin Wall, which essentially brings the Cold War to a close, and so it removes some of the geopolitical glue in the U.S.-China relationship because American policymakers are no longer so worried about containing the Soviet Union. The second, of course, is the Tiananmen Square massacre and the impact that had on U.S.-China relations, basically in reminding American policymakers and lots of ordinary Americans that in whatever ways China had changed since the beginning of the reform and opening period in 1978, and it had changed quite a lot, it was still run by sort of a fundamentally repressive, thuggish regime that was willing to kill lots of its own people to remain in power. And so when you put those two things together, American policymakers, when they started looking out around the world in the early 1990s after the Cold War ended and wondering where the next big threat might come from, China was an obvious place to look. And if you look at national security strategy documents, Defense Department documents from sort of the 1990 to 1992 period, many of them did explicitly identify China as a potential future competitor to the United States. But the hope, and this is what characterized the third period of U.S.-China relations, was that hostility and competition were not inevitable. They were not foreordained because the U.S. could pursue a two-pronged strategy that would give China incentives, both positive and negative, to integrate into an international system led by the U.S. and its allies. And this is the period that I would call engaging and hedging from 1989 to 2016. And so everybody is familiar, I think, with the way that the United States engaged China during this period. It worked to draw it further into the international economy, to make it more prosperous on the theory that doing so would make China a more satisfied, a more responsible member of the international system. It would have very little incentive to disrupt a system that had made it rich and prosperous and influential. There was also the hedging part of this, where the United States was trying to sent a couple of carrier strike groups to the area around Taiwan to discourage the Chinese to stop firing missiles over Taipei and things like that. This was not a bad policy. It's hard for me to see what the reasonable alternative was, particularly in the 1990s. It just didn't turn out as American policymakers hoped for a bunch of reasons. One, I think American policymakers underestimated how tough, how ruthless, how tenacious the Chinese Communist Party was, and they underestimated the degree to which the Chinese Communist Party had no intention of allowing any sort of meaningful political reform, even as economic reform took hold. I think they also just underestimated how strong and how powerful China was going to get in a relatively short period of time. China's growth during the 1990s and 2000s in particular was just utterly explosive. We're talking about 10, 11, 12% annual growth rates in terms of GDP. And so Chinese economic power got big a lot faster than American policymakers thought it would. And so Chinese military power started getting more prominent faster than a lot of American policymakers thought it would as well. All of this then was amplified when Xi Jinping took the helm in 2012. And the signs of assertiveness in Chinese policy that had started to emerge before that, in the South China Sea, for instance, in 2009 and 2010, got a lot louder on a whole bunch of different fronts over the next few years. And so really by the time you get to the 2016 presidential election in the United States, it had become clear that the engagement paradigm or the engagement hedging paradigm that the United States had been pursuing, maybe it had failed, maybe it was in the process of failing, but it simply wasn't delivering the desired result of a China that was more liberal and more reconciled to the U.S.-led international order. You were actually getting the opposite. You were getting a China that was more autocratic and that was less reconciled to the international system as it became more powerful and more capable of challenging that system. We all know that Donald Trump won the 2016 election, of course, and really since he was sworn in as president in January 2017, we have been in a new era, the fourth era of modern U.S.-China relations. I'm going to call it sort of the new Cold War here. People can argue about whether they think that's an appropriate term or not, but I think that this new era has been defined really by comprehensive competition, both functionally and globally. And by that what I mean by that is that U.S.-China competition is playing out in every area of statecraft and in basically every region of the world. It's not just happening in East Asia and the Western Pacific, although that is where the military part of the competition is most intense. It's happening in Latin America, it's happening in sub-Saharan Africa, it's happening in Southeastern Europe, and so on and so forth. And it's happening not just in the military realm, which is what a lot of people in Washington worried most about a decade ago, and what many people in Washington still worry most about. It's happening in the ideological realm, it's happening in international institutions, it's happening at the frontiers of technological innovation, it's happening in the contest for geoeconomic influence with countries around the globe, and so on and so forth, right? And so you have a competition that really reaches into basically every part of the world and every part of U.S. and Chinese statecraft. So that's where we are in terms of the overall relationship. Let me talk a little bit about Donald Trump's role and how we got here and where we are today. As I alluded to a moment ago, Trump's first term was pretty transformational in the American approach toward China. It was the Trump administration in its national security strategy and national defense strategy from 2017 and 2018 that first sort of explicitly identified China as America's foremost competitor. It sort of stripped away all of the euphemisms about a complex and sometimes challenging relationship and basically said China represents the foremost threat to the sort of international system that the United States is trying to bring about. It was also the Trump administration that reoriented a whole bunch of institutions of the U.S. government in a bid to deal with this. And so the intelligence community shifted from what had been a very heavy counterterrorism focus over the past 15 years to focusing more on assessing the capabilities and intentions of great power rivals with China at the top of that list. You saw the FBI become much more aggressive in going after Chinese influence operations in the United States. You saw a national defense strategy that was heavily focused on shoring up the front line in the Western Pacific, and so on and so forth. The U.S. created new institutions to deal with the China challenge, the International Development Finance Corporation, sort of a counter Belt and Road initiative being the most important of those. The United States started building or reviving new coalitions to try to deal with the China challenge in the Western Pacific. The best example here would probably be the rebirth of the Quad, so the U.S., Japan, Australia, and India in 2017 after it had sort of been in hibernation for about a decade. And many of the Trump administration's policies formed the building blocks of U.S. policy toward China over the past 8 years. You had Trump's effort to sort of hem in Huawei technologically by choking off its access to high-end semiconductors. That, of course, was the basis of the much broader Biden administration effort to choke off China as a whole from the highest end semiconductors. The Biden administration, when it came into office, maintained all of the Trump tariffs that had been put on place in China and added some new ones in specific sectors like EVs as well. Biden picked up the coalition building aspect of Trump's Indo-Pacific strategy and ran with it in a way that I think the Trump administration would not have been capable of. And so it developed an array of trilateral, minilateral, quadrilateral relationships. It invested in bilateral alliances with Japan and the Philippines. It built on a number of Trump-era initiatives to try to expand U.S. military posture and access in the Western Pacific. And if you look at the unclassified version of the Biden administration's national defense strategy, it's basically version 2.0 of the Trump administration's national defense strategy from 4 years earlier. And so Trump laid the foundations in all of these ways. And it was also during his administration that I think you had the emergence of this fairly strong bipartisan consensus that China was the biggest, most dangerous competitor that the U.S. faced, and it needed to be dealt with as such. And where's Zach? Zach, sitting over there, wrote a very good piece on this in, 2019? This is the new Washington consensus piece? Yeah. So these are all of the ways in which I think the Trump administration put this new paradigm into place. But to understand this, and to understand particularly where we are today, you have to understand that Trump himself was always the most ambivalent of the new Cold Warriors. Trump came at U.S.-China relations from a fundamentally economic and a fundamentally transactional perspective. And so he was willing to apply pressure on China, particularly in the economic and the technological realm. And his willingness to get tougher with China in those areas and to sort of talk about the relationship in a new way, created space for advisors and officials elsewhere in the government, elsewhere in the bureaucracy, who could then push their own hawkish agendas on defense or on other issues. But Trump, for a long time, saw the point of those measures as bringing China to the point where it would be willing to make a big, beautiful trade deal with the United States. And this was the objective that Trump really chased for about 3 years of his presidency. And he seemed to get it in early 2020 when the United States and China signed their Phase 1 trade deal, which was always a little bit overblown. It was basically just a bunch of Chinese commitments to buy more American goods and do things like that. But it gave Trump the win he was looking for. What happened next was unexpected, because what happened next was COVID. And it was only with COVID, which destroyed Trump's presidency, in his view, and for which he blamed China and Xi Jinping personally, that Trump really decisively sided with the hawks in his own administration. And if you talk to some of those people, they will tell you that they got more done on China policy in the 9 months between March 2020 and January 2021 than they had gotten done in the 3 years before that. And so Trump presided over this shift in U.S.-China relations, but there were whole pieces of the relationship that he was never that particularly concerned about. I'm not sure that he ever really placed a lot of emphasis on, Second Thomas Shoal or other hotspots in the South China Sea, perhaps not even on Taiwan itself. And so you have to understand all of that, because that really gives you the backdrop to Trump 2.0. And so when Trump was elected for his second term, and when he took office in January 2025, it initially looked like you might have a very strong, very hawkish U.S. approach to China. I'm old enough to remember when Mike Waltz was the national security advisor, and he and Marco Rubio were deemed the super hawks, right? These were sort of very forward-leaning people with a long record of advocating for sharper U.S. policies on China on everything from human rights to technology to defense in the Western Pacific. And of course, Trump came out very, very strong on China policy, particularly on foreign economic policy. And so there was that sort of 1 week period between April 2nd and April 9th, 2025, when the administration unveiled high tariffs on China after a couple of preliminary rounds of sort of fentanyl-based tariffs. And you got this ratchet effect because the Chinese retaliated, and you had essentially a de facto trade embargo in place between the United States and China because they had the United States had a 130 or 140% tariff on Chinese goods. I think the going-in assumption on Trump's part was that China was unlikely to fight back in a trade war because the Chinese economy, in the view of Trump and some of the people around him, was in such bad shape that she would have no choice but to make a deal. That wasn't the case. You got this escalatory ratchet effect instead. And what became clear within a few weeks was that Trump's approach to China had backfired. It had backfired because such a high level of tariffs, as I said, sort of a de facto trade embargo, was going to have wrenching effects on both economies, but particularly on the United States. And so you started hearing this rumor, there would be no goods on the shelves for back-to-school shopping in the summer or for Christmas in the winter. And at the same time, what became clear was that the Chinese had gone to school on the American economic coercion toolkit, and they had developed a toolkit of their own. And the most powerful weapon in there were the export controls on rare earth elements, which were put in place in April and May, and immediately had a pretty significant effect on industries not just in the United States, but in a variety of countries around the world. I think the Trump administration was taken aback by the impact of those export controls in particular. And I think the Trump administration has basically been backpedaling ever since on U.S.-China relations. And there are a variety of things I can sort of point to in that respect. The administration reversed an earlier decision to bar exports of NVIDIA's H20 chips to China. These are sort of not quite cutting edge, but fairly advanced chips that can play an important role in Chinese military modernization in particular. It has been reported that the United States has basically frozen further export controls or competitive technological actions against China since May or early June. And by the way, if you're not continually updating export controls or other sanctions, almost by definition, they're getting weaker, right? Because the other side is finding ways of evading and getting around them. And so if you're not moving forward, if you're standing still, you're actually going backwards. And so U.S. export controls and sanctions have become looser on China over this period. And then at the end of July and early August, the administration decided to make it very difficult for the president of Taiwan, President Lai, to make his transit through the United States, largely out of concern about annoying Beijing. Since then, President Trump has been pressuring India, but not China, to stop buying Russian oil as a way of bringing the war in Ukraine to an end. He has continued to punt on the question of whether TikTok should be banned or divested, and so on and so forth. There are a bunch of different explanations for what Trump is doing. One explanation is that he's simply playing for time. He's trying to strengthen America's position on rare earths and other things, and then we'll be back to a harder line policy. If you just listen to what President Trump is saying, which I think is usually the best guide to his actions, I think he's chasing a grand bargain with Beijing. And there are a bunch of things that the United States, from Trump's perspective, wants from China. It wants further cooperation on slowing fentanyl shipments in the United States. Trump wants to lock in asymmetric tariff rates. He thinks it'll be a big win for him if the U.S. has higher tariffs on Chinese goods than China has on American goods. He might want greater market access in China for U.S. firms, perhaps a certain reduction of tensions or an agreement to pursue military deconfliction in the Western Pacific. Above all, he wants the Chinese to put the rare earth export control gun away, and he's been willing to pay a fair amount in all the ways I just mentioned to get it. And I think sort of Trump's dream scenario, or at least this was his dream scenario 2 or 3 weeks ago, was that this would all come together eventually at a summit in Beijing sometime in the fall. I think that's the vision that Trump has of where U.S.-China relations are going. But I think there are two basic problems with all of this. The first is that Trump is having a hard time landing this bargain. And I think the fundamental reason for this is that the Chinese government can sense that Trump is in a hurry and that he is in a relatively weak with the grand bargain approach, which is that regardless of whether Trump gets his trip to Beijing, regardless of whether he can have a big signing ceremony with solemn commitments on both sides, no grand bargain, I think, is likely to survive in the U.S.-China relationship. And the reason for this is that whatever sort of the day-to-day tactical considerations, the fundamentals of the relationship are still terrible. The U.S. and China have utterly opposing interests in the Western Pacific, where China would like to see the U.S. alliance system disassembled or rendered irrelevant, and the United States would like to maintain it as part of its effort to systems, and that creates a residue of mistrust that is very hard to get over. The last point I would make is simply that it's impossible for either side to sort of unsee or forget the history of the last 8 or 9 years. Both sides have seen over the past 5, 6, 7, 8 years the ways in which economic interdependence can be exploited, it can be weaponized, it can be used for coercive purposes. And so neither side is going to want to go back to sort of the deep, complex interdependence that we had prior to 2015 or so. Yes, the Chinese may want greater access to certain U.S. technology, but they're also sprinting for self-reliance in a number of these areas. I assume the United States will be doing the same thing when it comes to areas like rare earths. So you put all this together, and I think, unfortunately, the reality is that we're not going to get a grand bargain that lasts. That said, the question is sort of like, is it a good idea or not to chase this sort of bargain in the first place? I can sympathize with the perspective that says, well, it's worth trying because this is a fundamentally important relationship, and so anything that has some prospect of moderating tensions, even over the medium term, is worth doing. I do think, though, that there's a danger in the approach that the Trump administration is following, which is that we're going to end up back in a hotly contested relationship, but in a worse position than before. We're going to end up in a re-intensified technological fight, but in the meantime, the U.S. will have given China access to important technology at a critical moment in the sprint for better AI-enabled capabilities. I think there is a danger that Trump is going to, and in fact already has, weakened the political consensus on competition with China in the United States. I think there's a real danger, for reasons that go beyond Trump's approach to China, that the U.S. is in the process of weakening relationships in this region and globally, primarily as a result of the fact that the U.S. is using tariffs as coercively against its allies as it is against some of its enemies. And I also worry that the U.S. has already significantly undermined its ability to get multilateral buy-in on future sets of export controls or other tech controls, because U.S. allies like Japan or the Netherlands, countries that play really important roles in these supply chains, they have to be worried that they're going to agree to do something that will incur costs in their relationship with China, only to see the U.S. pivot and sort of trade away those export controls the next week or the next month. And then finally, I would worry that I think the United States is in danger of sending some pretty mixed messages about its commitment to Taiwan and to Western Pacific security at a time when the military balance is shifting in some pretty dangerous ways. And so I'll just wrap up by saying that I think the impulse to try to moderate tensions, to find areas of cooperation, can be a healthy one. But I worry that the way that the present administration is pursuing it may actually lead us into a more fraught, more dangerous place. And I'll stop there, and I look forward to the discussion.
Very much, Professor Brents. I've scribbled down a lot of stuff, and I'm not sure if I want to ask those questions, but perhaps I'll just open the time to the audience. We'll take one or two questions, and then let's see how it goes. All right, before we take the questions, can I kindly request that you introduce yourself, your name and where you're from, and then ask the questions. Keep your questions short, otherwise I will have to interrupt you. Okay, over at the back, the gentleman there.
Brock Hirschberger, we met last week, but for the room, I'm a visiting fellow at RSIS from the U.S. Army War College. My question is about demographics. Do you see demographics in the next 5 to 10 years, specifically aging societies, in China and other countries, the U.S., Europe? How does that play a role in the U.S.-China relationship, both with trade and security over the course of the next 5 to 10 years?
Great question. Why don't you?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, the way I have thought about this is that China in particular. So the good news, I guess, from a competitive perspective, if you're an American, is that China has, of course, very severe demographic challenges ahead of it. Depending on which projection you look at, the population of China may be half of what it is today by the time we get to the end of the century. Just even in the next 10 to 15 years, China is going to be shedding lots of young people and adding lots of old people, and that's going to create further economic strains. It's going to create further social strains and further political challenges, all things equal, for the government in China. And all of that will probably serve to make China, to weaken China's competitive position over the long term, at least as it compares to the United States. But I hasten to add that there are a bunch of sort of big caveats that we have to associate with that. The first is that the United States and other countries cannot count on China's demographic problems to save them from what I think will be the most dangerous part of the relationship, which will be sometime in the next 5 to 10 years, because the demographic crunch won't really start to be felt in a way that would be sort of crippling to Chinese power until you're beyond that window. And so it doesn't get there soon enough to save you, if that's the way in which you're thinking about it. The second caveat is that it's always possible that a China that believes that it is in an advantageous position at the moment, but has severe long-term problems that will weaken its competitive position over time, economic challenges being one, demographic challenges being another, could behave more aggressively between now and then. It could decide to take greater risks to try to lock in gains while it's best able to do so. This is not unheard of in the history of international affairs. And in fact, what we've seen historically is that the most dangerous revisionist powers are not the ones that sort of believe that their trajectory continues to point like this. It's the ones that worry that they're going like this. And that was one of the things that made Germany so volatile and so dangerous in the run-up to World War I. And you can see some parallels in the Chinese case today. But then the third caveat is that China's demographic problems are bad, but the demographic problems of American allies are also severe, particularly when you look at this part of the world. They're severe in Japan. They are severe in South Korea. They are severe in certain ways in Singapore. And so there are real questions about what that's going to do to economic performance, what it's going to do to military manning in places where the United States has placed a lot of emphasis in recent decades as we look to the years ahead. And so I don't know if I can issue sort of a confident judgment about where all this is going to net out. I think that the demographic issue is going to pose serious challenges for both sides of the U.S.-China competition. And the last point I'll make here is that of all of the countries I just mentioned, the United States has the healthiest demographic profile, and that's good. But the only thing that is keeping the U.S. population growing for the moment is immigration. So, the fertility rate in the United States is about 1.6, which is not enough to get you there. But it goes up to 2.1 or 2.0, or at least it has in recent years when you factor in immigration. We're currently in the middle of, I think, a paradigm shift in how the United States thinks about the role and the pluses and minuses of large-scale immigration in its own society. And so if the United States comes out of this in a place where it is taking a more restrictive approach to immigration, there may be pluses and minuses to that, but one of the challenges it will create is it will compound some of the demographic weaknesses in the United States itself.
Thank you. Over at the back.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Brands, for an amazing presentation. I'm Raganika from the Institute of South Asian Studies. So my question is regarding the sale of the advanced chips to China, given the very obvious national security implications of technology advancements in AI. I wanted to understand whether this decision will also adversely affect United States technopolarity vis-a-vis its partners, and will this impact the competitive edge that America holds in this field? And if I may add another question into the mix, as the frontier technologies are predicted to play a greater role in defense architecture in the Indo-Pacific, where does America's security strategy stand with the current pervasive developments in defense technology in China? Thank you.
Okay, a couple of good questions. So really from, let's say, 2019 onward, which was when the U.S. really got serious about trying to cut off Huawei first, and then particularly from 2022 on, or when the Biden administration announced its more sweeping set of export controls, the theory of the case informing the U.S. approach to technological competition was that you were entering a really important window in which critical breakthroughs and critical developments would happen. And so you needed to maintain, it was worth using export controls aggressively to try to maintain as large a lead as possible, as long as possible, even if you understood that they wouldn't necessarily work forever. And so with respect to the Huawei decision, it was really about delaying Huawei's global 5G rollout and hoping that you could develop alternatives along the way. With respect to the Biden administration, I think it was about sort of the combination of worrying that you were getting closer to a period in which military conflict was possible in the Western Pacific, but also that you were entering the window when AI development, and particularly AGI development, would really take off. And you really wanted the United States to occupy the frontier of innovation in those areas. And so you needed to starve China of the really high-end chips in particular, the inference chips in particular, the logic and the inference chips in particular, that could be used to train the best models, and then to help apply their fruits across a variety of areas. The Trump administration is now offering a different theory of the case when it comes to technological competition, and I cannot tell how seriously to take it, to be honest with you. So the new theory of the case is that export controls fail, and they have failed because they simply incentivized China to double down on its own indigenous innovation. My own view is that part of the new theory is empirically untrue. And if you listen to the CEO of DeepSeek, he will tell you that the number one thing holding DeepSeek back has been lack of access to advanced chips. But the second part of the theory basically goes, okay, if you want to maximize American technological advantage, you need to maximize global market share for American firms. So you create a tech ecosystem that is as US dominated as possible, and you need to get China as addicted as possible to high-end US technology. And that is the part that I don't understand how seriously to take. Because if you take that argument to an extreme, it becomes absurd, right? The United States would not sell F-35 fighters to China on the theory that this will get China addicted to US military technology, right? There comes a point when that argument is simply illogical and self-defeating. And so part of it may relate to the fact that, you have movers and shakers within industry who have gotten access to the White House and have made arguments that are in their own self-interest and managed to convince the president of them. And so we shouldn't rule out the possibility that the sort of get them as addicted as possible argument is almost an ex post facto rationalization for decisions that are being driven by different motives. Okay, on the second piece of it, I think that the U.S. military has understood for a number of years that autonomy, other applications of new technology are going to be really important to any sort of defense in the Western Pacific, because what you're basically trying to do is flip China's anti-access area denial strategy against it, make it really hard to project large amounts of force over significant bodies of water. And if you want to do that, you've got to be able to find ways of massing firepower that don't require putting your largest, most vulnerable that for that to happen, DoD is going to have to prove a lot quicker and a lot more agile at developing and fielding at scale capabilities than it has in the past. The second is that it's probably a mistake to think about those sort of cheap, plentiful, attritable capabilities as replacements for larger, more expensive tools of power projection. They're probably more like complements, or they're things that you use at a particular phase in the conflict, and then you bring other tools to bear, because you're still talking, you got to get these things across the Pacific in the first place, and then at some point you're going to have to break the blockade or defeat the invasion or whatever the case may be. And so I think these are very important tools of military power in the current context, but we have to sort of keep them within a larger perspective.
Thank you very much. We have more questions. All right, let's take two questions for change. So the lady in front, and then over to you.
Hi, thanks, Professor Brandt. That was really interesting. I'm Kirsten Conrad. I'm just a member of the general public. And one conclusion one might draw from your presentation was that China's figured the U.S. out. And it's got 3 years now to concentrate on what it's been doing. And it stated that its most important relationship now, or at least it's shifting its focus from the U.S. relationship to neighbors and ASEAN. And I'm wondering how you think the U.S. can respond to that, especially given that U.S. is putting a lot of its former allies at arm's length. Thank you.
Okay, let's take another question with you. Yes, sir. I'll bring it to you.
Okay, thank you, Professor Brandt. I'm Yichao from RSIS IP program. So my question is about the new Cold War. Just mentioned that China and the U.S. used to have some deep, complex dependence, but now it would not have. So I read the RAND cooperation report maybe beginning of this year. They say that, okay, the competition between China and U.S., especially in the trade and technology, would last 10 years, but U.S. would not totally decoupling with China because U.S. want to keep some leverage to influence China. So do you agree with that point? Another one is that, okay, we used to hear the term like small yard hard fence, but nowadays it's really hard for the businessman or for some expert to discern from which one is sensitive area, which one is not sensitive, which one is not related to the national security. Do you think it's possible to draw a clear line between that in the future? Thank you.
Okay, let's take those two questions.
Sure. On the last part first, no, it's never going to be possible to draw sort of a bright red line between areas of Sino-American trade that are strategic and sensitive and areas that are not. Like you can clearly think of an example that would be sensitive, the most advanced semiconductors, right? And you can clearly think of an example that would not be sensitive. T-shirts, washing machines, right? You know, relatively low-end, non-strategic trade. And then the question becomes, where do you draw the boundary sort of between those areas? And I think that is destined to be more of an art than a science, you know, looking out over a number of years. I think the key is to develop an approach that is based on relatively clear principles. And also, I would say, to develop an approach that is not transactional in nature, because part of the problem we have right now is that there are areas where the U.S. government has said these are too sensitive to do 3 months ago that now are outside of that fence, right? And so what you need is a more consistent approach that is not in danger of being traded away, because that at least creates some predictability and some transparency in the economic relationship that allows people to make decisions about whether the venture that they're proposing to do is going to fall on one side of the line or the other. I think the line has just gotten hopelessly muddled over the past few months. On the question of sort of decoupling, I'll just say, look, I'm not in favor of wholesale economic decoupling between the United States and China. Deeply transactional by nature, even though he is an erratic and, in the Chinese view, unreliable negotiating partner. They have figured out that he has a relatively limited tolerance for economic pain and for the political pain that can follow. More tolerance than I think many of us thought during the first term, but it's still a limited tolerance, as we saw in the fallout from April 2nd, and then the Sino-American trade war in May and June. And they have figured out that he is less attached to sort of the strategic aspects of competition than the Biden administration was, right? So the Biden administration always said, you can like or you cannot like a set of export controls, but we're not negotiating with Beijing over them. These are things we're doing because we think they are in our interest. We will inform China about them. We will try to be as transparent as possible. But these things are not there to be traded away. Trump thinks about it differently. And so all of that, I think, creates an opportunity for China to do things that really can wrong-foot the United States and wrong-foot the coalition that the United States leads. And I think the Taiwan transit issue was a perfect example of that, where basically Beijing said, look, this would be really bad. It would spoil the good mood that we've established from these meetings in London and Geneva. You shouldn't let this get in the way of this deal that we're pursuing. And Trump basically went for that. I'm a little bit, I think one possibility is that the Chinese government will propose deals that will sound reasonable to someone like Trump, who is not deeply invested in the strategic aspects of competition with China, but will actually weaken the U.S. position. And so one of the ideas that's been floated is maybe the Chinese government would finally agree to meaningful military deconfliction in the Western Pacific, right? Our planes will stay 400 meters apart from each other in exchange for some U.S. concession on Taiwan, right? And that has been sort of a long-standing Chinese position. If you want deconfliction, stop doing things we don't like in the Western Pacific. And the U.S. has resisted that for years and years and years. But I could see a President Trump going for that because he can argue that it reduces the risk of war. He's less attached to Taiwan in the first place, and so on and so forth. Trump obviously also creates opportunities for China just in the friction that he introduces into U.S. alliance relationships. I think that's clear. I will say, I think there are two sort of countervailing dynamics to keep in mind. Defense spending in the Western Pacific is going to rise more rapidly under a Trump administration than it would have risen under a Biden administration, because the Trump administration is willing to be so much more confrontational in dealing with U.S. allies about this. Now you can make up your own mind whether you think that is a net gain or a net loss for the United States, but you are likely to see Japanese and Australian and other countries' military spending rise more quickly over the next 4 or 5 years than it might have otherwise, and that creates some dilemmas for China. The other point I make, though, is that China sometimes has a hard time getting out of its own way. There is a lot of room for China to make mischief in U.S.-Europe relations right now, but the Chinese find that very hard to do because of the role that they're playing in supporting Russia and Ukraine, and because of the economic model they're following, which is creating as many problems for Europe as it is for the United States. I would think that China has, in some ways, some good cards to play in Southeast Asia, but it continues this very intense campaign of coercion and gradual expansion in the South China Sea, which is messing up any opportunity, I think, to generate a change of attitudes in places like the Philippines, which were quite ambivalent about alignment with the U.S. only a few years ago under the Duterte administration. And so China has some opportunities in front of it, but I'm not convinced that they're going to make the most of them.
Thank you. We have more questions. All right. William over at the back, and then Kevin, I'll come to you later.
Thank you. Will James, RSIS. You set out very clearly, Professor Brand, some reasons why the grand bargain might not work. But let's kind of play the scenario out and say it is successful. Where does that leave key US allies if the grand bargain does happen, even if it's just kind of aesthetics? But some of which, of course, some of these allies have experienced a lot of US coercion on the China issue and more recently the Taiwan issue, thinking of Australia, on the AUKUS situation, how much they might be prepared to put in for a Taiwan scenario there. So where does it leave US allies, and if there's a difference, just picking up on your last comment there, between European allies, key European allies, and key allies in Asia? And then secondly, I was reacting to something you've said quite a lot here, which is about Trump's transactionalism, which I agree with, but there's also a strong element with Trump of emotion in his decision-making, particularly when his ego is affected or involved. And so I was wondering, is there a danger, just piggybacking off one of the last questions, if you read Trump as a transactional character and then you end up embarrassing him in some way, you could end up with someone who actually ends up being quite resolved on a few issues, which could lead to some inadvertent pushback.
Kevin?
Thanks, Professor. Kevin, US Program, RSIS. My question kind of builds on your responses from the past few answers, talking about, export restrictions on Huawei to delay their rollout. One of the terms that gets applied to US strategy quite often, whether rightly or not, is containment of China. Do you feel that kind of phrasing is helpful, especially when it's considered in the context of, George Kennan's long telegram and what the US did during the Cold War? Or are there problems with that kind of term as well? Thank you.
All right, let's take these two questions.
Okay, so let me start with Will's. So yeah, I mean, Trump, he wears his emotions on his sleeve, and emotionalism is a decent way of explaining what ultimately happened in his policy toward China during term one, right? And so, for lack of a better word, Trump got really pissed off as a result of COVID. He used some extremely choice language, which I won't repeat, in describing what he thought the pandemic had done to his political prospects. And he became, much more hard-edged, I think primarily not because of sort of the danger that COVID revealed about, the lack of accountability in the Chinese government or things like that, but mainly because he thought it had hurt him personally, and he was angry about that. And this is one of the reasons why I think one of the near-term dangers to the grand bargain scenario is that the Chinese government overplays its hand, that it thinks that it's in a stronger position than it actually is, that it basically refuses to give Trump movement on either the issues he cares about or the theatrics that he cares about, and Trump eventually gets very upset and goes off in a different direction. And that's always a danger in dealing with Trump. And I think it simply underscores the rationale for why a grand bargain is going to be hard, because it ultimately requires both Xi Jinping and this very mercurial American leader remaining committed to it over the course of this presidency, and that's to say nothing about what happens after Trump leaves office. In terms of where it leaves U.S. allies, I think it leaves them in an extremely uncomfortable place. And so I was having a meeting with a Chinese official a few weeks ago where he basically said, look, our goal is to get rid of the 20% tariffs on fentanyl, and then get the sort of reciprocal tariff down to 10%. And a 10% reciprocal tariff, of course, would be lower than the tariff that most U.S. allies are paying. And so if, whether the Chinese are able to achieve that or not, I don't know. But if they do, that would send a really strong signal about how Trump views the economic relationship with China in contrast to the economic relationship with Japan or the European Union or other countries. I think the second part of this is that the Trump administration is going in two very different directions when it comes to Western Pacific security and Taiwan in particular. And so at the Defense Department, Taiwan is like the be-all, end-all of U.S. strategy globally, not just in the Western Pacific. And, the number one question, according to published reports, that the Pentagon has been pushing U.S. allies to answer is, what are you going to do when China attacks Taiwan? We understand you have your own policies of strategic ambiguity and so on and so forth, but you need to be very clear about how committed you are in this contingency. And at the same time, in many ways, Trump has muddled U.S. policy on Taiwan with the transit issue. And I find it hard to imagine how Trump gets the Beijing signing ceremony he wants without making some concession on Taiwan that Xi Jinping can take home, whether that is, a fourth communique, whether that is some change in the language about U.S. policy toward Taiwan, a shift from the U.S. does not support Taiwan independence to the U.S. opposes Taiwan independence, something that only 500 people in the world pay attention to, but some of those people are the people who run governments in allied countries, and I think it will strike them as discordant, to say the very least, if the U.S. position on Taiwan is becoming more ambivalent at the same time they're being asked to ramp up military spending in expectation of the Taiwan war and to make clear exactly where they stand on these issues. So I think it just leaves them in an uncomfortable position in that respect. And moreover, I mean, the real challenge that U.S. allies are going to face is that they will have they're likely to have fraught relations with the United States in a variety of ways over the next few years. That's challenging enough. It's even more challenging when you are uncertain where the United States stands vis-a-vis your principal security threat, and that's the situation that they'll be put in. Kevin, on So my view on containment is that it is an accurate but unhelpful description of what the United States is trying to do vis-a-vis China. You know, when somebody says containment, in my view, a containment strategy does not have to look exactly like the strategy that the U.S. pursued vis-a-vis the Soviet Union during the Cold War. The core, sort of the essence of a containment strategy is you are trying to inhibit the malign expression of a competitor's influence by means short of war, right? That was the guts of it during the Cold War, and I think that's basically what the United States is trying to do today. It's trying to prevent China from overturning the existing order in the Western Pacific. It's trying to prevent China from winning the race to rule key technologies. It's trying to prevent China from imposing its writ on international institutions, and it's trying to do all that, hopefully, without having to resort to military conflict. To my mind, that is a form of a containment strategy. And there was a while where I was trying to convince people that we shouldn't be afraid of the word in describing what the United States is trying to do. I think I eventually gave up on that because I failed utterly to convince people that a containment strategy didn't have to look exactly like Cold War containment vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. And so even though it's accurate, I think it derails the debate immediately when that word is used. And so now I only use it when I'm trying to be a troll or to stir controversy.
Thank you. Let's take a look at. Okay, we still have got more questions. One over here, and then Terence. Can you introduce yourself?
Yeah. Hi, I'm Yachi from RSIS. I'm also previously working as a researcher at Seminole Chinese think tank on U.S.-China policy. So my question is with the coming military parade. As you may know, that Beijing is going to set a very symbolic and also a very substantial military parade on the 15th anniversary of its so-called Victory Day on September 3rd. So my question is about Professor Brand. How did you read China's primary motive and their intended message to Washington at this time for, let's say, deterrence or whatever on Taiwan, and what mysteries should the U.S. avoid?
What was the last part of that?
What mysteries should the U.S. avoid in interpreting this event?
What
Yeah.
messages?
Yeah,
What
kind?
missteps should the U.S. avoid?
Yeah.
Okay.
Hi, Hal. Terence from RSIS Senior Fellow. I want to push you on the premise which you began your talk with, and that you stated pretty much unequivocally that it's a new Cold War between China and the United States. So I want to push you there on thinking about to what extent this is an apt characterization. Because if it is a Cold War in the traditional Soviet-US thinking, that means that the world is apt. It's a good time for a grand bargain, i.e. Soviet-Russian style, in which when the two leaders get together, then you have all these big treaties from START, SALT, and all these big things that regulated international relations for a better part of 60 years. So why is this era different than from what it was during the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States?
Yeah, I can answer that one first. I am not totally attached to the idea of a new Cold War. I've used it in the past, and I'll explain why in a minute, but I understand that it rubs some people the wrong way, and so it doesn't bother me when people use a different phrase, competition, rivalry, whatever, to describe the U.S.-China relationship, as long as we're talking about the same thing. The sense in which I have used the phrase is the same sense in which I think containment is an apt descriptor of U.S. policy. I don't think the Cold War was the only Cold War we've seen in history, and I don't think it should dominate our understanding of what a Cold War is. I think of a Cold War as just a protracted competition between countries that see the world in different ways and want different things for the world that exists for the meantime in the space between war and peace, even though an escalation to war is always possible. And so if you think about it in that sense, I mean, Cold Wars have been going on for a long, long time, and the U.S.-Soviet Cold War was just one of a much larger set of cases that we can look to. And it had unique elements that I think are unlikely ever to be repeated. We're not ever going to get, I think, something exactly like the ideological nature of the U.S.-Soviet Cold War. We're not ever going to get another conflict that plays out at the same historical moment, because of course, two of the things that made the U.S.-Soviet Cold War so fraught were that, one, it happened in the wake of World War II when there was devastation across large swaths of Eurasia in particular, and two, it happened in the context of decolonization, which really turbocharged the competition for influence in the Cold War. And there's nothing, remotely like that today, and it's hard for me to foresee a scenario. And so all of this is a means to say that, like, I don't feel, when I say new Cold War, I am not implying that there is a need to follow the Cold War playbook, the U.S.-Soviet Cold War playbook, or the U.S.-Soviet Cold War rhythm, right? And so that can pertain to, it's impossible to mount a containment strategy that is as comprehensive as the one that the United States mounted vis-a-vis the Soviet Union, because China is just much more interconnected globally than the Soviets ever were. It could also pertain to the idea that just because détente emerged at a certain time in the U.S.-Soviet Cold War, it has to emerge at a similar time in the U.S.-China Cold War. Now, if you, I'm happy to sort of take the question seriously, and I guess I would say, like, if I am following sort of the rhythm, if I'm trying to impose the rhythm of the U.S.-Soviet Cold War on this competition, I would say that some of the prerequisites for détente have not yet been met. One that has not been yet is that Stalin hasn't died yet, right? And so, Xi Jinping in this scenario is Stalin. I can imagine shifts in Chinese governance. I can imagine shifts in Chinese foreign policy, for better or worse, after Xi. I think it might take something like that to get the relationship into a place where we're not just talking about a very tactical, momentary de-escalation, but some movement toward a calmer, more sustained rhythm. The second, and this won't make anybody feel any better, is that we haven't had our Cuban Missile Crisis yet, right? We haven't had the military crisis that just scares the living daylights out of everybody and leads them to say, okay, we have to have certain rules of the road here to make sure this thing doesn't get totally out of control. Maybe you can make the argument that we have had a mini version of the economic Cuban Missile Crisis when things got really bad in April and May of this year. I'm not quite convinced of that, but I think you can make that case. But on the security side, I don't think we've had it, and for better or worse, probably worse, I think it will take something that really gets people's attention and signals the danger of just a cataclysmic war to really put us in the place where the U.S. and or China are willing to think about, okay, what are the really hard trade-offs we're willing to make on what we take to be our primary security interests in order to fundamentally decrease the danger of war. And also, by the way, I think those trade-offs are going to be harder in this competition than they were during the Cold War because neither side considered Berlin its territory. Right? The other question, what is China trying to message the United States? There are people who are far better at sort of reading Beijing than I am, but what I take away is that China is trying to convince the United States that it is in a strong position, that it is not intimidated by U.S. coercion, and that its ability to shape the relationship in favorable ways is getting stronger over time. I think that is one of the reasons why the Chinese government felt that it should and probably had to hit back pretty hard after Trump introduced the Liberation Day tariffs, and China was really, the only country out there to punch back as hard as it did. I think you can see some similar things when it comes to military capabilities. And so there have been a variety of cases over the past couple of years where the Chinese have conveniently arranged for new capabilities to be photographed and shown around the world, whether those are sort of like the mulberries, the floating docks they would try to use in an invasion of Taiwan, or other capabilities. And part of this is just the way that militaries sort of try to shape each other's understanding of their capabilities in any context. But I do think that part of Xi Jinping's coercion game vis-a-vis Taiwan is to convince Taiwan and the United States that the military balance is shifting inexorably in China's favor, that it's getting closer and closer to the time when it has a credible Taiwan coercion or invasion option, and thereby to push Taipei and Washington to make concessions that they would not otherwise make. I'm not sure that strategy is working, but at least vis-a-vis Taiwan, but it seems to me that is part of the message that Beijing is trying to convey.
All right, we've got about 20 minutes left. Can I just check how many questions we've got? Okay, if you have a question, raise up your hands, or else that's it. Okay, just one question. I'm going to just sneak in one question. I've been enjoying moderating this discussion because I don't have to speak at all. But let me just ask a question. And this also builds upon what has been asked earlier. In your view, Hal, do you think there is, hearing from what you say about the possibility of grand bargain as no long-term grand bargain is possible, certainly when Stalin is not dead yet. So do you think right now there is anything the United States can do to convince China that the US is not out to sort of regime change or sort of lead to its collapse? Is there anything you can do to sort of get China on board and say, hey, don't be frightened of us? Vice versa, do you think, is there anything that the Chinese can do that would not give the impression to the United States that we want to challenge you? Because speaking to many Chinese scholars, I get the impression that the Chinese, they always say, we are not here to challenge the US. We've got our own problems that we need to solve. So is that reason valid to the United States, or that just sort of, you don't believe it?
I think part of the problem from the American perspective is that, Americans in government and in academia think tanks have become less and less convinced that, the Chinese academics they talk to have any meaningful connection to decision making in Beijing than might have been the case 15 years ago. And so the Chinese system has become tighter, more centralized, more of a black box under Xi Jinping. And so, unfortunately, many of the Chinese academics and think tankers who were fairly well connected to government in an early era, that may no longer be the case. And so it's almost as much of a problem of the messenger as the message. On the U.S. side, I'll be honest, I'm pretty cynical about this. It's hard for me to imagine what the United States could do that would fundamentally reassure China about American intentions without undercutting the American competitive position along the way. And I suppose the reason I think this is that, if you go back and look at what Chinese officials were saying publicly, so in the 1990s, the 2000s, the early 2010s, when the thrust of U.S. policy was about helping China become more prosperous, to accelerate its development, to accelerate its integration into the international system, there are lots of examples of Chinese officials and basically saying, we think the United States is trying to overthrow the Chinese Communist Party. And what makes it, now that was not true in an operational sense. I'm fairly confident in saying that the CIA was not trying to destabilize the Chinese government at that point. But what makes it tricky is that the allegation, in sort of an indirect way, is not entirely false, because American policymakers were always very clear that they hoped the endpoint of this process of Chinese integration into the international system would be some sort of change in the nature of Chinese governance, whether it was a China that was willing, just to put it very bluntly, to occupy second tier in an American-led international system, or a China that liberalized politically as the middle class grew and demanded more political rights. And so I think, Chinese leaders were wrong to suggest the United States was trying to overthrow the regime. They were right to suspect that the United States would prefer a different political system in China. And that just gets to sort of the fundamental drivers of the competition: strategic, geopolitical, economic, ideological. And I think when you take those into account, it's just hard for me to sort of imagine what the U.S. could do at relatively low cost to itself that would fundamentally change the perception of American intentions in China.
Right. One final question. I think the lady in front. Yep.
Hi, thank you, Professor Brands. This has really been interesting, and so have many of the questions. I'm Rebecca Wu, also a member of the general public, and my questions with bracket S sort of build on some of the comments that have come up. One, in terms of you saying that maybe China has figured out Trump, maybe not the whole US policy, but in some ways then looking right now, if you have Putin as well being able to negotiate, are we seeing something similar, which also adds another flavor, as you said, in general to the US and China relations? And the second thing is, you also sort of slightly tongue-in-cheek said nothing has happened like the death of Stalin, which would change the Chinese behavior potentially. I'm guessing that there's an implication there that even if there's a change in the US, say right now from Trump to Vance, you're not seeing, assuming that there would be that sort of change that could, in direction of policy and behavior. Incorrectly, perhaps.
Yeah, no, I think that's basically right. For all the reasons that I just sort of mentioned, and trying to articulate why it would be hard for the U.S. to reassure China. I think that Trump is actually less hawkish on China than most members of the Republican Party, and he's also, the fascination with tariffs is a little bit of a uniquely Trump phenomenon. Even protectionism has been gaining steam in the United States, don't get me wrong, for a while, but there's a reason Trump calls himself tariff man, which is that nobody's as fascinated with tariffs as Trump is, and nobody is as fascinated with using them omnidirectionally, right, against everybody as Trump is, and so we'll get ups and downs in the U.S. political system, but it is hard for me to imagine the next president, unless something really weird happens, being sort of fundamentally more conciliatory toward China, absent some intervening crisis or variable that none of us can foresee at this point. On the Putin analogy, I'll just say, look, I think we are stuck in the movie Groundhog Day when it comes to U.S. policy toward Russia and Ukraine right now, where it's literally just the same thing over and over and over again, right? And so Putin can have a phone call with Trump, he can go to Alaska to meet with Trump, and he can flatter Trump, and he can put forward reasonable sounding proposals, but what Putin cannot do is disguise the reality that he is bent on subjugating Ukraine and conquering more of its territory and turning it into a client state of Russia. And so what you end up with is these weird moments where it appears that Trump is sort of veering in Putin's direction, and then he realizes that Putin is not as serious as Putin said he was about looking for a peace agreement, and he sort of moves back to a position that's a little bit more supportive of Ukraine and the Europeans. And I think where this just leaves you is sort of drift in U.S. policy. I think you're unlikely to see sort of decisive pivot in support of the Russian position. I would also be a little bit surprised if Trump were to become much more aggressive in trying to pressure Russia and support Ukraine, because he's made very clear, he thinks this is Biden's war rather than Trump's war. It never would have started if he had been president. And he just doesn't seem to want to get over that psychological hurdle of investing a lot more of his his own prestige and capital in the conflict.
Thank you. We have actually 10 minutes left, and I'm happy to sort of call this session to an end, given Professor Brands giving us a masterclass on answering all your questions. But I would just want to check if there are any more questions, because sometimes what we have is people don't ask, and then after the meeting ends, the whole troop of people coming to the front and asking him for the next half an hour. So I just want to check if there are any more outstanding questions, because Professor Brand will probably have to go off shortly after this, so we don't want him to be staying here and answering more questions after the session ends. So any last questions, comments? All right, last one for you. Yes, I knew that was coming. Yeah, please introduce yourself and keep your questions short. And this will be the last one. Okay.
Hi, my name is Tharman. I'm a research intern at RSIS under the Indonesia program. So my question is with regards to US-Taiwan relations. So at least from what I believe is that US interest in Taiwan is twofold. On one hand is maybe the ideological imperative to maybe prevent the spread of communism to Taiwan. Then on the economic front, I do see that TSMC, because of how it produces about close to 90% of the high-end chips, that America will want to preserve, to protect Taiwan to ensure economic security. So my question therefore is, if US is able to become self-sufficient in producing its own chips, would America then take a softer touch with regard to Taiwan? Perhaps it could be a loss that it is willing to take. Yeah.
I think it really depends on who you ask. So I basically agree. I would say, look, the U.S. has an ideological interest in supporting Taiwan, although it's less about sort of opposing the spread of communism than supporting, a really admirable democracy that's being pressured by sort of a big bad autocratic regime. There is sort of the military or the geopolitical component of it, which has to do with everything from sort of like Taiwan's geography at the center of the first island chain, to the effect that a U.S. failure or inability to defend Taiwan would have on other U.S. alliances in the region. And if you go to the Pentagon, or if you go to other parts of the U.S. government, that's often what you will hear about as sort of the core of the U.S. interest on Taiwan. And those elements of the discussion, I think, were looming quite large before anybody had thought much about TSMC, right? And so the U.S. sort of commitment, the quasi-commitment to preserving a free Taiwan, it predates TSMC. It predates, obsession with TSMC's role in semiconductor supply chains. And so I think we would be in a similar position even if TSMC did not exist. But I do think there are some people, and President Trump might be one of them, who view Taiwan's importance primarily in technological and economic terms. And so if you sort of offered them a fantasy scenario in which, like, you can flip a switch and the U.S. will be self-sufficient in semiconductors, would you care about Taiwan anymore? I think Trump's answer would be no. And I think there are some people on the Democratic side of the aisle who sort of candidly would if you administered the sodium pentothal, they would tell you the same thing. The reality, though, is that you can build more semiconductors in the United States, but getting to a place of sort of true semiconductor independence, whatever that even means, like that is a really long-term aspiration for the United States. And in any foreseeable future, the vast majority of the most advanced chips are still going to come from Taiwan for the next decade and probably beyond. And so I think that the question is, it's a little bit hypothetical, a little bit academic in the sense that I don't actually see how we get there on a timeline that would allow the United States to meaningfully sort of write off Taiwan as a technological necessity. Maybe it's a different conversation 10 to 15 years from now once Trump has totally re-energized Intel and you have lots of semiconductor production in the United States and so on and so forth. But I think that's still a ways off.
Thank you. On this note, we'll bring the talk to a close. It's indeed a very sobering and realistic analysis of the current competition, US-China relations. I don't think probably left us, at least for me, with more answers rather than questions, but I think that is a hallmark of a good talk where you actually think about these issues. So with that, let's once again thank Professor Helbrands for this very stimulating conversation.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, and we wish him all the best and safe travels back to DC. Awesome. Thank you very much.